Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Tracy Lehman, the Community Outreach Counselor for Nick Finnegan Counseling Center, and today we will be creating another video interview about trauma and re-traumatization related to the current pandemic. And I have with us today my very good friend and colleague, April Henderson, who I will allow to introduce herself. April, welcome.
Hi everyone, Tracy, thanks for talking with me today. Yeah, as Tracy said, today we're going to be talking about trauma and re-traumatization and what that means and how that might be happening to people during this COVID pandemic. Like Tracy said, I'm a therapist at the Nick Finnegan Counseling Center. I have specialized training and experience working with trauma and attachment and brain development. As part of my work at Nick Finnegan, I also do a specialized type of trauma treatment called Emdr, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. It's kind of a long name, but really it's just a specialized treatment that was started in working with trauma, but now we use it on all sorts of things: anxiety, depression, addiction. And so all of that work really makes me excited to talk to you all about today about this topic. So thanks for having me, Tracy.
Great, we're happy to have you here. So since we're talking about trauma, and I've had a lot of people or clients that when we go through, during initial assessment, we kind of talk about what all things might be in your background or history that might be affecting your mental health. And one of the things I ask about is traumatic events. And I found that some people, don't realize an event was traumatic until they go back through it. So can you talk a little bit about what trauma is exactly to help kind of people identify it?
Yeah, so trauma is our response to an event that we go through. And normally it's a horrible event, but it's our mental, our emotional, our physiological response to trauma. So not just how we think about an event, but how we emotionally process it, how our body processes it, because the interesting thing about studying trauma is that we know that our body reacts to that trauma as well, and how we think about the trauma. So not just what happened, but how it makes us think about ourselves and our world. So trauma, kind of to explain it again, is an event happens, and then we process it in a certain way that makes it traumatic for us.
Just depends on the person, how they experience an event, if I'm understanding it correctly. However something that might be traumatic to one person might not be as traumatic to another person. It just kind of depends on how our body and our senses and our emotions all react to them. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen trauma being experienced by clients and what kind of ways you think this pandemic is or could be creating traumatic events or situations for people right now?
You're exactly right, Tracy, that trauma is really unique to each person, that what may be traumatic or overwhelming for one person may not feel that way to another person. And I didn't say this before, but of course, examples of trauma, of course, are natural disasters, mass shootings, things of that nature that someone would obviously consider that traumatic. But others examples of trauma that are maybe smaller or more relational could be things like abandonment, emotional or physical abuse, loss of a loved one. Again, kind of like I said, any hard event that we kind of encoded in our system as traumatic or hard or that's unprocessed can be a traumatic event. So with COVID, of course, with this pandemic, it can be very traumatic for people, depending on their background or what's been hard for them. If they've gone through a similar experience with maybe medical trauma, with feeling stuck or not knowing what's going to happen next, if they've had past experiences that revolve around fear of the unknown, or of course, fear of germs or being safe or being clean, then this could be a really hard time for them.
Right, so they could be re-experiencing past traumas or have traumas triggered, but also they could be experiencing maybe new traumas, kind of like what we've been seeing as far as like doctors and nurses in New York who feel very helpless to do what they've been trained to do because of lack of resources. or, being the person in the hospital with COVID that can't get their family, doesn't know what's going to happen to them, or even be the family members waiting outside, or even, if I'm understanding it correctly, you can also experience trauma by witnessing trauma or like hearing about trauma as a secondary. Is it secondary trauma, April?
Yeah, so I think to answer your first question, you're right. Unfortunately, all of those experiences that you just mentioned can be very traumatic for a person. And when I say traumatic, I just mean very hard, that it really sticks with us. And I think that's the unique thing about traumatic experiences, is that they really stick with us. We can't shake them. I've had clients tell me that they just can't stop thinking about this traumatic event, or they get flashbacks, they go back to it. And so all of those things that you mentioned about hospital workers or family members, of course, all of those experiences, unfortunately, are very traumatic, and can lead to trauma. And you're right, if people have gone through hard events before, hard traumas before, it can lead to re-traumatization, which is what we're kind of talking about today. And re-traumatization is the idea that you've gone through one hard trauma, or maybe many hard traumas, and then those original traumas or trauma get triggered again, and not just in a way that's like a flashback, like a quick kind of memory or snap of it, but you really feel like your body and your emotions are going back to that original event, and it feels very intense, even though maybe in the present moment you're safe, you're okay, but you're really just, I use the term a lot with clients, like flooded. Your whole system is just kind of overwhelmed and kind of goes back to that original traumatic event.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really intense. It's a really intense experience when you're re-traumatized and when you're being triggered around your trauma. Can you talk a little bit about some of the symptoms or dysfunction somebody might experience as a result of a trauma?
Yeah, so just again, with a general trauma, those experiences, or the way that you would know maybe that you've been traumatized, are kind of in various ways. And again, they vary person to person, but physically, you might notice that after you've gone through a horrible event, and now it's kind of become traumatic for you, is you'll have different, of course, emotional symptoms. So, anxiety and depression that have lasted for a while. That can escalate and turn into things like paranoia, difficulty trusting people. Even with trauma, it's not uncommon for people to experience what's called dissociation, which is just another word for disconnecting from reality. So you're numbing out, you're not connected to the present, you're kind of shutting down, and you're really, again, losing touch with what's kind of happening in the present moment, as a way to kind of cope with that traumatic experience. And of course, physical symptoms like dizziness, difficulty concentrating, headaches, nausea, all those things as well. Because when we go through trauma, our whole system is overloaded and doesn't feel safe. So our body is going to react in these ways that it would normally react if we're, safe and calm.
So it sounds like safety is the main element that is triggered by trauma. How can somebody know if they're experiencing trauma specifically during this pandemic? And what types of symptoms or behaviors or reactions should they be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so of course, this COVID pandemic is hard for us in so many ways. And, it can affect us by, in a kind of mild way of just feeling, inconvenient, having some anxiety that pops up from time to time, maybe if you've watched the news, or, even for me, like getting groceries from the grocery store can feel a little like anxiety producing, because we're worried about those germs and that exposure and everything. But kind of where it crosses the line to where maybe this kind of pandemic situation has led to a trauma is really the intensity and the frequency of what you want to look out for. So it's normal to have days where you feel tired or maybe sad or a little anxious, but you want to look for the intensity of that. So if you're having more days than not of feeling depressed, not being able to get off the couch, not able to maybe remote into work or take care of your kids, that's definitely something to look out for. or with, anxiety, feeling so anxious that you can't concentrate. They're having panic attacks, so, having difficulty breathing, feeling lightheaded. It's something to look out for that, something might have, made an experience traumatic. Also, and this is kind of going on maybe more than I should, but, if you're feeling panicky, feeling paranoid, those are kind of the most basic examples of how, something during this pandemic might have triggered something for you and might have felt traumatic for you.
So if someone's experiencing these symptoms that you just described, what kinds of things do you think they can do to offset the impact of the trauma or to cope with the traumatic experiences or re-traumatization they might be having?
Yeah, so if someone has gone through something during this pandemic that has felt traumatic and it's really sticking with them. So of course, if you've gone through something hard, it's going to make you feel sad or anxious or depressed, make you worried. That's normal. When we go through something hard, it's normal for us to feel those feelings. But again, it's the intensity of it and how long it's gone on. So if you've gone through something difficult and, I know this pandemic's only been going on for a certain amount of time, but if you've noticed those symptoms really sticking around day after day for a week, 2 weeks, that might be a sign again that it's really impacted you in a significant way and been traumatic for you. And so, first, if you'd like, you could start by reaching out to other people that you're close to, friends, a faith, person of faith, so a pastor, a priest, rabbi, those sorts of things. People in your immediate circle that you have access to that are safe, understanding, that value your privacy, and can give you good insight and support. You can start there. If you don't have those people in your circle, or if that doesn't seem to be helping, or even if you just immediately want to, you can reach out to a therapist, your doctor, a psychiatrist, people that are trained in mental health that can help you take the next steps toward healing is really important, because you want to have someone who can know how to help you. Sometimes just reaching out to that inner circle of support can be enough, because with trauma, it's really important that you want to process it through. You don't want to allow it to just get stuck. So talking about it sometimes in a mindful way can be helpful. But again, if those things don't seem to be helping, definitely encourage someone to reach out to a mental health professional.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely reach out if you are feeling overwhelmed by these experiences. Those of us in Houston were just recovering from Harvey, and that was a lot of isolation, a lot of not knowing what's going on outside, a lot of fear of what's going to come into your home. I just can kind of see a lot of parallels there when I think about it. And I know that was traumatic to some people. So people who know they have that, have had that experience, how could they, offset that being re-triggered during this pandemic?
Yeah, so it seems crazy, but Harvey was actually, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, so a little while ago. Yeah. So, but yeah, and again, Harvey was hard in so many ways for all of us, and I think you're right that there can be a lot of parallels to Harvey and what's happening now, because Harvey impacted us as a city in a huge way. So many people were impacted with Harvey, like so many people are impacted by this pandemic. Of course, this pandemic unfortunately has kind of hit a global scale, but we all as a community are experiencing something difficult. And I think that, again, is how you're right, that this is similar to Harvey. And of course, things like, I know things have gotten a little bit better at some grocery stores, but access to food, cleaning supplies, not knowing when things are going to kind of like, quote unquote, return back to normal. I think those are some of the parallels, not being able to see friends or family, or just feeling kind of stuck, that those are similarities. And so I think your next question was, how can people kind of prevent or keep themselves from maybe being re-traumatized? Is that correct? Yeah, so I think with that, it's, and like we have said before, re-traumatization is getting triggered, and that triggering leads to your system kind of going back to that original event. So a very intense flashback is kind of a way to think about it. So it takes, I think, some work, because at first I would say avoiding those triggers requires some mindfulness. And that can be hard, because sometimes we can be triggered by things that we would not think would trigger us. But it does require some mindfulness, some knowing yourself. And that's, as we kind of mentioned before, where talking to a mental health professional can be helpful because they can help you figure out what those triggers are. But if you're not able to do that, then again, just noticing what's happening, noticing if things are making you feel anxious. I talk to clients a lot about right now, especially monitoring their intake of the news and social media, because I feel like almost all of my clients are reporting to me, and myself included, that after I watch the news or look through social media, that has caused some anxiety. So again, my long answer to your question is being mindful of your triggers is one thing. The other thing that's really important with helping to prevent against re-traumatization is having as much as you can with understanding that everyone who may be watching this comes from different types of homes, but having a stable environment. And so we know that re-traumatization is likely to happen with people who are in unstable, unhealthy environments, or maybe they're in abusive relationships. And so as best you can, trying to create a safe and steady environment for yourself is important. And then coping skills, which we may get to a little bit later in the conversation, but those can be really helpful with dealing with those triggers.
So you're saying that kind of being mindful of what's going on within you and, within your mind and within your body is really important in preventing being re-traumatized or experiencing, the full intensity of a traumatic experience. And can you talk a little bit about, or a little bit more about some other things that maybe people can do, having a stable environment, reaching out for support? Are there any other things people can do in the immediate setting to help manage their symptoms? Maybe they, on a wait list for therapy or something like that. So what can they do right now, do you think, that would help them cope in the interim between being able to access help and experiencing this type of trauma or re-traumatization?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tracy. So forgive me if I'm going to give us a kind of a long list of things. So especially during this pandemic, I think if you're noticing that your past trauma is being triggered, or even if you don't have past trauma, if just this pandemic has felt really difficult for you, one of the things that I'll start with is that it's important that we move. It's easy maybe for some, maybe not so much for others that, that maybe are working from home or caring for other people to stay still. But if you notice that you're just kind of sitting on your couch, I know there's lots of memes and jokes about that right now, binging, Netflix and stuff, but it is important that we get up and move. So if it doesn't feel safe to take a walk, around your block, around your house or apartment complex, walking around your apartment, even just standing outside your door and getting some fresh air, that our body physically needs to move. We need to have a sense of what's called agency, doing something and being productive. So something as simple as telling yourself, I'm going to get up and I'm going to make my bed and take a shower. Because obviously if you're experiencing depression, being really productive is going to be challenging. But just simple things and kind of building on that. That's really important and can help with some of those, again, those depressive symptoms or anxious symptoms that we're getting up and we're physically moving. The next thing is to try to build in a little bit of predictability. Because again, this is an unpredictable time, so we can't control everything, but we can kind of focus on what's within our realm. So maybe, hopefully, as some people have lived into this a little bit longer, they've developed a rhythm. But even just setting in your day, again, kind of going on what I was saying earlier, but okay, I know I'm going to wake up, I'm going to make my bed, I'm going to take a shower, I'm going to eat some breakfast, and trying to develop a pattern in that. It doesn't have to be a very strict schedule. Like, again, I know some people in the beginning, we're doing lots of postings about strict schedules with kids, and that may work for some people, but it may not work for you. But just having a flow and a rhythm to our day, knowing what we're going to do next. Those are some things that can be helpful. Another thing that can be helpful, of course, is coping skills, mindfulness, and meditation. So coping skills are just our way to deal with difficult emotions. Those can be different for everybody, what works for you. So, and then mindfulness is being mindful of our body in the present, kind of getting back into our body, being grounded. and meditation, of course. Some people are more familiar with prayer, deep breathing, that kind of thing. So coping skills could be things like taking a bath, taking a walk, sitting outside in the sun, even just drinking some water and eating a snack, anything that calms our body down. Because the hard thing with trauma and with being re-traumatized is that our brain is kind of taking us into fight or flight mode. And in a very kind of intense way to say it, our brain is telling our body that we're going to die and we need to be, we need to get safe, or we need to do something to protect ourselves. But if we're in our home and the environment is safe, then physically we know we're safe, even if our brain is kind of telling us we're not safe. And so coping skills can kind of calm our body down, as well as deep breathing. So just taking a deep breath in through your nose, exhaling through your mouth, doing that several times can be another way to calm our body down, to cope and deal with those big emotions that we may be experiencing. And as I mentioned, mindfulness or grounding is just our way of kind of, sitting, slowing down, noticing the things around us, taking some deep breaths. Again, it's really just trying to do whatever we can to calm our body and our brain down. Because when we're going through these really hard emotions because we've experienced trauma or we're re-traumatized and we're feeling triggered again, it's just really important that we do whatever we can to calm our body down and help us feel safe again.
Fantastic information, April. Thank you so much for that. And then if, like I said, maybe somebody's using these skills in the interim of waiting to get into therapy, can you talk a little bit to, and I'm not trying to curveball you, but I might change this question because I know we talked about this earlier, but when someone should definitely start seeking out some professional help related to trauma, and maybe what to expect when going to therapy for trauma?
Yeah. So if you have gone through a trauma and you're noticing that it's still impacting you, so maybe you're having, difficulty with kind of some of the symptoms that I mentioned before, difficulty sleeping, difficulty focusing, if you're having trouble in your relationships with other people, having healthy relationships, difficulty with your job, family, those are some signs that trauma may be impacting you in a big way. And that's when I would say it's good to seek out a mental health professional. And certainly if you're being re-traumatized, having panic attacks, having flashbacks, again, that's a sign that meeting with a mental health professional could be really helpful for you. And I love your question about what to expect, because I think there is definitely some fear in what is therapy going to look like. And of course, every therapist does things a little bit differently. Every therapist has a different personality style. But generally in that first meeting, you can expect that they're going to want to get some background information. They're going to want to know what's going on with you. And there's going to be just some administrative logistics of explaining how therapy works and confidentiality and those kinds of things. But that first session is really just going to be that introduction. Those sessions from there on are going to be kind of some information gathering and making a plan of what treatment's going to look like. So I do think it is important for clients to know that sometimes it can take time in therapy. It's definitely not a quick fix, especially when we're talking about trauma. But I do love that there is hope in the healing process, that these things can take time. And but one of the reasons I love working with clients who've experienced trauma, as weird as that might be to say, is that there's a lot of hope in it, that we can be going from one place of feeling devastated or overwhelmed or being unsure of ourselves, to hopefully getting to a place where we feel much more confident, much more powerful, self-assured. And that ideally a mental health professional can help a person heal and move on from those traumatic experiences.
Great. Thanks, April. I love that. I love that idea of hope in therapy. And I just think just the theme of hope is so important right now. So many of us just want some hope that we're going to come out of this soon, that there's going to be some normalcy returning. So I love that, going to therapy or working in therapy, working with trauma is about hope, and that there's so much hope in coming out of it. For those of you watching who might be relating to some of the things that April has talked about today, and are experiencing some strong reactions, please know that you guys can reach out to us at Nick Finnegan Counseling Center. We have several therapists trained or in the training process for EMDR that work with trauma, and we are here to help. Our phone number is 713-402-5046. So reach out if you need us. We are here. And thank you so much, April, for being here and talking with us about trauma and re-traumatization and how we can help take care of ourselves and each other better.
Thank you so much, Tracy.